Hi, we're reading Captain Underpants and the Big Bad Battle of the Bionic Booger Boy. Part 2, The Revenge of the Ridiculous Robo Boogers by Dav Pilkey. We left off on Chapter 15. Chapter 15, 65 million years before the day before yesterday. George and Harold grabbed a box of saltine crackers off Miss Singerbrain's desk. Then the two friends stepped inside the purple potty and closed the door. Quickly, George reset the controls and pulled down on the chain. A flash of green light lit up the room and the purple potty vanished. Suddenly, George and Harold were transported back in time to the late Cretaceous period of the Mesozoic era, a time when dinosaurs ruled the earth. Cautiously, George and Harold peeked out from the purple potty, which was now nestled precariously in the branches of a tall tree. "Here, Chickie, Chickie, Chickie!" called George. "Polly, want a cracker?" called Harold as he tossed a handful of saltines into the air. Suddenly the two boys were swarmed by hungry pterodactyls. Before long, a friendly-looking pterodactyl, a Quetzalcoatlus to be exact, swooped down and grabbed some crackers from Harold's hand. "Aw, look," said Harold. "He likes me." "Great," said George. "Let's get him into the time machine and get out of here." Carefully, Harold took the pterodactyl in his arms and carried him into the purple potty. Then the boys closed the door behind them, reset the controls, and pulled down on the chain. Suddenly, George and Harold and their new reptilian pal were transported forward in time to the day before yesterday. The door of the time machine swung open and the three friends sailed out of the purple potty, through the library window, and up over the town. George looked down on the city streets until finally he located Miss Singerbrain's car. "There she is!" George cried. "I sure love our new pterodactyl," said Harold. "I'm going to name him Crackers." "Don't give him a name," said George. "We're not keeping him. We're just borrowing him." George, Harold, and Crackers swooped down and landed on Miss Singerbrain's car, which was parked at a traffic light. Miss Singerbrain screamed in horror. "Ah!" "Wait!" cried George. "There's no reason to be afraid. You're just dreaming." "I'm dreaming?" asked Miss Singerbrains. "Sure. Think about it," said Harold. "Purple potties appearing out of nowhere, kids running around with lasers, zappers, pterosaurs landing on your car. This stuff only happens in dreams." "Gosh, you're right," said Miss Singerbrains. "But it all seems so real." "Well, trust us," said George. "In a few minutes you won't remember any of it." Before long, George, Harold, and Miss Singerbrains were all gliding back to school with their good old pal Crackers. The Combinatron 2000 and the Forgetchmcallit 2000 were safe once again. Soon they arrived back at the library. "I'll keep an eye on Miss Singerbrain," said George. "You take that pterodactyl back where we found him." "Aw, can't we keep him?" asked Harold. "No," said George sternly. "He belongs in his own time. Now take him back." "Aw, man," said Harold. Sadly, Harold carried Crackers into the purple potty and closed the door. After a few seconds, the time machine disappeared in a flash of green light. A half hour later, another flash of green light filled the room and the purple potty was back. "What took you so long?" asked George. Nothing," said Harold. "Did you have any trouble taking Crackers back to his home?" asked George. Not really," said Harold. "You did take him back to his home, didn't you?" asked George. Sure, said Harold, though he didn't sound very sure. Quickly, George zapped Miss Singerbrains with the Forgetchmacallit 2000 and jumped into the purple potty. Then, with a quick flash of green light, they were gone. Chapter 16. Back to the Present. Mr. Melvin was very happy to see his purple potty return to him, and even happier to see his beloved Combinatron 2000. Now all I need, he said with a sneer, is to find Captain Underpants. Fortunately, Captain Underpants, who you'll probably remember looked just like Melvin Sneedley, wasn't too far away. Unfortunately, he had spent the last 2 days getting himself into trouble. First, he started off by annoying some old ladies. Captain Underpants had been helping them cross the street when he heard a little girl crying for her kitten, which was stuck in a tree. Captain Underpants rescued the kitty but forgot about the old ladies. "Hey!" shouted one of the old ladies. "That flying kid up just left us up here in this tree!" "I'm gonna get that kid if it's the last thing I do," said the other old lady. Next, Captain Underpants was soaring above the football field when he encountered an unidentified flying object. It was made of brown leather and had white stitching on the side. Said Captain Underpants. "This could be a dangerous UFO." He grabbed it and flew down to the football field where, oddly, the school's football team was having a big game. "I don't want anybody to panic," Captain Underpants shouted, "but I just captured this UFO. I'm going to take it to the moon where it can be safely destroyed." Suddenly, the players from the visiting team tackled Captain Underpants, which cost the home team 50 yards and the game. "That kid just made us lose our biggest game of the year," shouted Mr. Meaner. "I'm going to get that kid if it's the last thing I do," snarled the quarterback. Finally, Captain Underpants got on the bad side of some skateboarders in the park. He had politely pointed out the "no skateboarding" signs, but the skateboarders refused to go away. So Captain Underpants had no chance but to snap their skateboards in half with his kung fu kicking action. No skateboarding. Then it was spankings for everyone. "Dude!" cried one of the skateboarders. "That little dude just duded our dude boards." "Dude," said another skateboard. "I'm gonna dude that dude if it's the last dude I dude." Chapter 17. The Big Switcheroony. Mr. Melvin ordered George and Harold to stick their heads out the window and call for Captain Underpants. Soon the waistband warrior appeared. Mr. Melvin welcomed the caped hero inside and asked him to pose for a photo. "Why, I'd be delighted," said Captain Underpants. "Great," said Mr. Melvin. "Put these clothes on and stand over there." At first, Captain Underpants was reluctant to put on clothes, but he finally agreed. Mr. Melvin, who had worked all afternoon reconfiguring the Combinatron 2000, pressed the start button, then ran and stood beside Captain Underpants. Suddenly, 2 glowing lasers began encoding the DNA of the 2 subjects it was about to combine. Then a burst of brilliant gray light shot out from the Combinatron 2000 and formed a ball of energy between Captain Underpants and Mr. Melvin. They both slid together into the gray light and formed a giant glob of fleshy goo. The newly reconfigured Combinatron 2000 then switched polarities and began the process of separating the 2 human elements. The gray ball of light slowly changed to a lovely shade of pink. Zap! Suddenly there was a blinding flash of light, a quick puff of smoke, and it was all over. Everybody's brains were back where they belonged. "Wow, that sure is a weird camera," said Captain Underpants, who now looked exactly like Captain Underpants. "Can I take these clothes off now?" They're bad for my image. Go right ahead, said Melvin Sneedly, who now looked exactly like Melvin Sneedly. Finally, it looked as if everything was back to normal. But, as we all know, looks can be deceiving. Chapter 18, The Return of the Ridiculous Robo Boogers. Just then, the Poopsie space shuttle landed at Piqua International Airport. It wasn't the smoothest of landings due to the fact that 3 robotic boogers had just eaten most of the shuttle's tail fin and nearly all of its rocket thrusters. Major Tomsky and his crew had barely escaped with their lives. Inside the school library, Captain Underpants heard the astronauts' panicked cries coming from the airport. "This looks like a job for me!" he shouted, and with a mighty tra-la-la, he leaped out the window and fell 3 stories to the ground. Crash! George and Harold screamed and ran downstairs. "Captain Underpants!" cried George. "Are you okay?" "Speak to us!" cried Harold. Captain Underpants slowly lifted his head in confusion. "Mommy," he said weakly, "my train went swimming in the piano." Meanwhile, over at Piqua International Airport, Carl, Trixie, and Frankenbooger had just finished eating the space shuttle and were now starting to munch on the control tower. The 3 globby gluttons grew bigger and bigger with every enormous bite. "Come on, Captain Underpants," cried George. "You gotta save these people." "But I forgot how to fly," Captain Underpants said sheepishly. "You didn't forget," laughed Melvin Sneedly, who was now floating above their heads. "You've just lost your superpowers. But don't worry, they've been safely transferred into my body. Now I'm the world's greatest superhero. Ha 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 ha." "Melvin!" cried George. "Those Robo-Boogers came back to Earth. They're attacking people at the airport. You've got to help those people." "I'm not doing a thing until you guys change that comic book," Melvin said. "And you'd better make me look cool this time." "But there's no time," cried Harold. "Those people need your help now." "Well, you better start drawing then, Art Boy," said Melvin. Chapter 19, Never Underestimate the Power of Underwear. George and Harold begged Melvin to use his superpowers to save the day, but Melvin continued to refuse. Finally, Captain Underpants stepped in. "You may have taken away my superpowers," the waistband warrior said, "but I still have the power of underwear on my side, and nobody can take that away from me." Captain Underpants turned and ran toward the airport. "Melvin!" cried George frantically. "If you don't do something, those boogers are going to kill Mr. Krupp." "That's not my fault," said Melvin. "You're the ones who wrote that stupid comic book about me. Now change it or else." George and Harold looked at each other. Their choice was simple: either fight with Captain Underpants and probably die, or give in to the dark side and live. The 2 boys turned and ran to the airport. Chapter 20, Booger Brunch. George and Harold quickly caught up with Captain Underpants. Soon they were all at the airport witnessing the carnage of the ridiculous Robo-Boogers. Captain Underpants shouted out a triumphant "Tra-la-la" from below. Suddenly the 3 Robo-Boogers turned toward the familiar-sounding voice. Quickly their laser-guided eyeballs zoomed in on the 3 of the heroes who had made their lives so miserable back in Chapter 1. Immediately the Robo-Boogers leaped at George, Harold, and Captain Underpants, and the chase was on. Again! Chapter 21, Cornered. The Robo Burgers continued chasing George, Harold, and Captain Underpants until at last the three frightened friends were cornered at the local shopping center. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, the three brave heroes began taking items from the outside sales bins and throwing them at the snarling beasts. George grabbed a pair of low-fat tennis shoes and tossed them at Trixie. Trixie gobbled them up. Harold found a delicious tube of wild cherry-flavored hemorrhoid ointment and flung it at Frankenbooger. Frankenbooger swallowed it whole. Captain Underpants picked up a genetically modified organic orange-flavored orange and chucked it at Carl. Carl chewed it up with a smug grin. Suddenly, Carl's laser eyes grew incredibly large. The haughty smile on his face turned into a panicked gasp as the wet, gushy snot that covered his body began to dry up and crumble. Huge, crispy booglets shot off his smoldering robotic endoskeleton like green popcorn. "What's going on?" cried Harold. "It's the oranges!" cried George. "It's got to be the vitamin C in these oranges. It's combating the cold and flu that caused these boogers to turn evil." Carl thrashed around brutally as more and more of his disintegrating body cracked off and fell to the ground. Finally, the lights in his panic-stricken laser eyes slowly went out. He stumbled over and crashed horribly into the parking lot. Carl was dead. Chapter 22, Vitamin See You Later. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants quickly began chucking oranges at Trixie and Frankenbooger. But the two remaining Robo-Boogers had gotten wise to the power of vitamin C. They ducked, jumped, dodged, and darted, doing whatever they could to avoid being hit by the deadly oranges. "Hey, I've got an idea," said Captain Underpants. He grabbed 2 crates of oranges and ran off, while George and Harold continued flinging fruit ferociously. "Where does he think he's going?" said George. "I don't know," said Harold, "but his idea better work. We're running out of oranges." Soon George and Harold were down to their last 2 oranges. They threw them as hard as they could, but alas, the potent projectiles missed their terrifying targets. Trixie and Frankenbooger grabbed George and Harold and dangled them above their gigantic mouths. "Well," said George, "it looks like this is the end." "Yep," said Harold. "It was nice knowing you, pal." Suddenly, the Robo-Boogers heard a familiar tra-la-la coming from somewhere over on the next page. The repulsive Robo-Boogers dropped George and Harold and stomped over to page 130. There they found Captain Underpants standing at the top of a large novelty toilet on the roof of John's house of toilets. He was shouting, "Tra-la-la!" and doing a very annoying dance which made the Robo-Boogers very, very angry. Chapter 23, The Underpants Dance in Flip-O-Rama. You've tried the twist, mastered the Macarena, and figured out the funky chicken. Now it's time to learn the most annoying dance ever, the Underpants Dance. It's sure to irritate parents, teachers, evil villains, and kids of all ages. Just follow the easy steps in this chapter and learn the Underpants Dance today. Introducing Flip-O-Rama, Pilkey brand. Here's how it works. Through the magic of Flip-O-Rama, anyone can learn how to do the Underpants dance. First, make sure you're wearing your underpants. Then follow the 4 easy steps illustrated in the next 16 pages. With a little bit of practice, you'll soon be the most irritating person you've ever met. Good luck. Step 1, the wedgie wiggle. Woo, 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 woo. Step 2, the toilet tango. Step 3, the waistband Watsy. Step 4, the big butt boogie. Chapter 24, Squishies, Part 2. Trixie and Frankenbooger had seen enough. They couldn't stand to watch Captain Underpants doing that stupid dance 1 second longer. So they pushed down on the seat of the large novelty toilet to hoist themselves up on the roof. Unfortunately for Trixie and Frankenbooger, they had been so irritated by the Underpants dance that they hadn't noticed the 2 crates of oranges placed carefully under the gigantic toilet seat. When they pressed down, the pressure of the toilet seat crushed the orange crates, spraying delicious vitamin-y orange juice all over their big, bad, boogery bodies. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants watched as their monstrous arch-enemies began decomposing before their very eyes. "What happened to them?" asked Harold. "I gave them a squishy," said Captain Underpants. "It's the latest fad." Splat. The Robo-Boogers jerked around wildly as the quickly drying snot crumbled off their smoking robotic endoskeletons. Then after a few minutes of spinning and screaming, they slowly tumbled to the ground in 2 metallic heaps. Trixie and Frankenbooger were dead. Chapter 25, Big Melvin. Soon Ingrid Ashley from Channel 4 Eyewitness News arrived at the scene. "How did you manage to destroy the Robo-Boogers?" she asked. "I'll answer that," said Melvin Sneedly as he swooped in front of the cameras. He was robed in some old drapes that he had tied around his neck at the last minute, and he looked quite silly. "I, Big Melvin, fought those monsters with my mighty superpowers," Melvin fibbed. "Then I destroyed them with my super smart brain." "No, you didn't," said Harold. "You weren't even here," said George. "Don't listen to those guys," said Melvin. "I, Big Melvin, am the real hero here." Melvin flew above the 2 defeated Robo-Boogers and used his new laser eye beams to burn the letters B and M in front of the dead creatures. "Just like Zorro," said Big Melvin, "I shall sign my initials on all of my heroic handiwork. From now on, whenever you see a big BM, you'll think of me." "That's funny," said George. "Big BMs have always made me think of you." Big Melvin flew over to Captain Underpants and grabbed him by the arm. "Now," said Big Melvin, "the entire world shall bear witness to the humiliating defeat of Captain Underpants." Suddenly George and Harold got an idea. They turned and ran back to the school while Big Melvin continued to threaten Captain Underpants. "I command you to bow down to me," shouted Big Melvin. "Never," said Captain Underpants. "You shall bow down to me," Big Melvin yelled. "I shan't," cried Captain Underpants. "Then," said Big Melvin as he untied the drapes round his neck, "you will feel the power of my wrath." Chapter 26, The Drapes of Wrath. Big Melvin held his drapes tightly, then smacked Captain Underpants in the tushy with them. "I command you to deny underwear and accept the power of Big Melvin," he shouted. "No way, Pedro," cried Captain Underpants. Big Melvin smacked Captain Underpants again. "Bow down to me," he commanded. "And I shall spare your life." "Ah, go jump off a duck," said Captain Underpants defiantly. Suddenly, George and Harold returned to the scene, out of breath and hiding something behind their backs. "Hey, Big Melvin!" shouted George, huffing and puffing. "What?" yelled Big Melvin. Harold pulled out the Combinotron 2000 out from behind his back and aimed it at Melvin and Captain Underpants. "You shouldn't leave your toys lying around the library, bub," he said slyly. Melvin shrieked in horror as Harold pulled the trigger. Blast! A blinding flash of gray light shot out of the Combinotron 2000, surrounding Melvin and Captain Underpants and squishing them together. George had reset the controller to combine them both, transfer the superpowers back to Captain Underpants, then separate them. "I sure hope this works," said Harold. "Me too," said George. Chapter 27. To make a long story short, it did. Bonk. Chapter 28. With big underwear comes big responsibility. Big Melvin fell to the ground with a thud. Immediately Captain Underpants began floating in the air. "Hey!" cried the good captain. "I've got my superpowers back. I knew that underwear would never let me down." George turned and zapped the Channel 4 Eyewitness News team with the Forgetchmacallit 2000. Flash. Suddenly, the Channel 4 Eyewitness News team, as well as everyone at home watching the story unfold on Channel 4 Eyewitness News, immediately forgot what had just happened. The horror was over, everything was back to normal, and everyone was happy. Well, everyone except Big Melvin, that is. "Wah!" sobbed Big Melvin. "I want my superpowers back." "Ah, quit your whining, bub," said George. "You've been a total jerk for the last 2 books. You should just be happy that you didn't get your comeuppance." Chapter 29. Comeuppance, See Me Sometime. Soon a crowd gathered and began to recognize Melvin. "Hey!" cried Miss Anthrop. "That's the little squirt who said he was going to fire my Heiny." "There he is!" shouted a couple of very angry old ladies. "That's the little brat who left us up in a tree." "He made us lose the big game!" cried the entire football team simultaneously. "Dudes!" yelled one of the skateboarders. "That's the little dude who duded our dude boards a few dudes ago." "Heh, heh," laughed Melvin nervously. "Maybe I'll just go home now." "Get him!" shouted the old ladies. "Ah!" screamed Melvin as he ran away, followed closely by a large group of very angry people. Chapter 30. Harold's Surprise. As Melvin and his angry mob ran off into the sunset, George and Harold had just one last quick thing to deal with. A quick squirt of water to Captain Underpants' face was all it took to bring him back to his cruppy old self. "Well, that takes care of that," said George, and the 2 boys walked back to their treehouse. As George climbed up the ladder to the treehouse, Harold became quite fidgety. Said Harold nervously. "There's something I should probably tell you, George." But when George reached the top of the ladder and looked inside the treehouse, no explanation was necessary. "Hey!" said George. "I thought you told me you took Crackers back to his home." "I did," said Harold, "back to his new home." "Harold," said George sternly, "we can't keep a pet pterodactyl. Do you know how many crackers they need to eat every day? We could never afford it." "I know," said Harold sadly, "but look how cute he is, and he's made friends with Sulu, too. Can't we just keep him for one night?" "Well, all right," said George, "but we're taking him back tomorrow." Chapter 31, Tomorrow. The next day, George, Harold, and Sulu returned to the school with crackers tucked snugly into Harold's book bag. Together, the four friends sneaked back upstairs to the library, where the purple potty stood before them in all its forbidden glory. "Come on," said George, "let's give this baby another spin." "I don't know," said Harold. "Maybe we should give it a day to cool off." "Nah, I'm sure it can be used 2 days in a row," said George. "What could possibly go wrong?" "But didn't Melvin warn us not to use this machine 2 days in a row?" asked Harold. "Yeah," said George, "back in chapter 12, starting with the first word in the third line of the second paragraph on page 77. "What exactly did he say?" asked Harold. "Beats me," said George. "I'm not very good at remembering details." "Well, I don't know about this," said Harold. "What if our journey brings about the end of the world as we know it?" "That's ridiculous," said George. "It all sounds like a setup for the sequel to a really lame children's book." The four friends stepped inside the purple potty and closed the door behind them. George set the controller to return them to the Cretaceous period of the Mesozoic era and then pulled the chain. Suddenly, an orange light began flashing wildly. "Hey, I don't remember seeing an orange light before," said Harold. Then the purple potty began to shake and rock violently. "I don't remember this thing shaking and rocking before either," said George. "Something is wrong!" cried Harold. "Something is terribly, terribly wrong!" Suddenly the entire room lit up with an explosive burst of lightning, and the purple potty began to disappear into a whirlwind of electric air. The only thing that could be heard above the chaotic clatter was the sound of two terrified voices screaming into the unknown abyss. "Oh no!" screamed one of the voices. "Here we go again!" screamed the other. Dun 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 dun. That's the end of this book. Thank you so much for reading with us. Please like this video and subscribe to @RozReads. We will see you at the next book. Thank you for listening. Bye.